Hi, I'm George Hussey, Dr. 914 from Automobile Atlanta, and today we're going to talk about the bent 914, which is this one. We happen to have had two Laguna Blue 75 1/8s at our shop at the exact same time. One during its life has gone through hell, and the other during its life probably through heaven. And by comparing these two, you'll be able to see what happens to a 914 when it's improperly bodyworked and what to look for. It's going to be a little bit difficult because bodywork covers up a lot of ills. They use too much Bondo, they put heavy paint on it, they grind edges to make body lines which aren't good. So by us doing a little investigation here, we'll find out exactly what has happened to this car. Porsche was one of the first to come out with a unibody car in the 356. That means, unlike a conventional car from years ago where they had a frame, think about it as a ladder with the suspension and the engine and transmission hung on it, and then the body put on top of that, Porsche made a car that had the fenders and the rocker panels and the floor pan and the quarter panels all welded into one solid piece. And the benefit of a unibody car is both strength and tightness. You have a car that when you go into a corner, the frame doesn't flex one way and the body flex another way, so it made for great handling. 914 was the same way. It was a unibody car. However, unlike a frame and body car where you can get in an accident and maybe bend the frame, but not necessarily the body, with a unibody car, you bend the whole car. And a lot of people don't know that. So the car is bent and all they see is a little bit of crash and a little bit of wrinkled fender. So they fix the wrinkled fender, but they don't fix the bent unibody. And from then on, they're driving a car sideways down the road, and I am exaggerating. So with that said, let's look at the beautiful first, and then we'll look at the not so beautiful. The 914s were made on the Volkswagen assembly line, and like any passenger car, the factory didn't think that 50 years from now these cars would still be on the road. So being a Volkswagen mass-produced, the body lines didn't have to be as perfect as maybe a Porsche 911. So by looking at these body lines and allowing for a little bit of variance, we can still discern what should and should not be. And on this car, I'm going to start at the front, and I'm going to go all the way around the car. So I have a yardstick here, not to measure, but to accentuate the difference in the body lines. I could get a tape measure and I could get the factory specs and I could measure the car, and then you can see by measuring it what is really off, but we're not doing that today. We're just showing you how to go around the car and look at it without getting too technical. So I'm going to look first at the hood, and I'm going to look at the cowl, and I'm going to look at the line between the cowl, which is affixed, and the hood, which bolts on, to see if the lines are even. And I look at the hood from the left to the right to make sure on this side and on that side the gap is the same, which it is. And then I look right down the fender to make sure the gap is, this side is the same and the gap on this side is the same, which it is. Maybe this gap is uniform, maybe a little bit wider than that, but that doesn't make any difference because the gap is uniform. Since the headlights bolt in, they're infinitely adjustable, so if they don't fit quite right, they can be made to fit. And then I'm going to look at the bumper top. It fits right into the gap on the fender here, and right over here where the fender takes a 90-degree bend, the cover fits perfectly into it, just the way it should. This is a 75-76 so-called crash bumper, so a little bit different than your early model. On the early model, the top seal fits into the notch on the fender. I'm going to look at the side of the fender into the door, and I'll put my ruler against it, and it looks very straight and nice. The front nose curves in just a little bit, but for the most part, it's nice and straight, and it matches the other side. Put my ruler up against here. And then one thing that I always look at for the fact that most cars get hit in the front end rather than the rear end, especially in a 914, I look at the bottom, what we call the dog leg, the bottom part of the fender. It looks like a dog leg. I put that up against the door, and I see this is very, very nice and straight, like it should be. Nice, good, straight line all the way back to the quarter panel here. So I know that this car is for the most part, very, very straight in the front, or somebody has done a magnificent job body working the car. And I move further back, looking first at the fit of the top. The top edge should overlap the rear roll bar chrome just a little bit, and the rubber seal is even with the left to right lateral rear roll bar chrome. You can see that fit. And then there's a uniform gap on the back of the glass. Now the glass is adjustable, so if it has a uniform gap here and a uniform gap here, it can be adjusted to where it doesn't have a uniform gap, so we can't really rely upon that much. Also, the front cap is almost even with the front windshield seal. That means that the window is tilted correctly as well. Then I move to the door gap. Traditionally, 914s have a little bit wider door gap at the top, but yet on the side, the gap is fairly and nicely uniform, as well as the front door gap. These vary, so one 914 may have a little bit of a wider door gap than another, but the doors were all the same, meaning the shape of the door and the bolt-on of the door, not the guts. So any 914 door will fit any 914, and they were never shimmed. They had that much precision going on to where they would put the 6 bolts in, bolt them down, the door would fit perfectly. So I'd say that's pretty good, unlike a 356 where they all had to be shimmed. Moving to the back, the first thing I do is I put my ruler up against the quarter panel, and I can see that this is almost flat. Not quite, but almost flat. It will hardly rock at all. The body line, for the most part, should be very, very straight here. Small flare. You can feel for the gap between the tire and the quarter panel. 914s all vary. Some of them are closer than others. That really doesn't make much difference. But if it's radically different, then you know there's a problem right away. I move over to the fit of the rear deck lid. The front of the deck lid should be even with the top of the quarter panel where it comes off the sail roll bar chrome. And if it's not even here, that means the trunk hinge cup that holds the hinge has been miswelded, and you'll have to either re-weld it or lift the deck lid with 8mm washers. And that determines the fit of the rear trunk as well, so you want it to be nice and even. This car actually is a little bit too low on the left side. So to make a perfect line like the factory would want, or near perfect, you'd have to put a couple of 8mm washers. The engine lid always has a problem after a while with straining the hinge bracket to where it bends down, it moves the lid back, and then you can't achieve a good line. And this one has been a victim of that just recently, I know for a fact, to where the deck lid is hitting the engine grill. So this would have to be welded and realigned and it would be all right. But really, the engine lid is not part of unibody alignment, so we don't need to worry about it. I have a perfectly straight line here and a perfectly straight line here. The deck may be off one side or the other, maybe the gap uniform, maybe a little bit wider, that's Volkswagen. And then the deck lid, you can look at the quarter panel. The deck lid should be in perfect align with the quarter panel right here. Nice flowing, smooth line. Taillights are all a little bit different, but for the most part, smooth line. And then I can put my finger under the deck lid and I can feel that all the way across is exactly the same gap. And that tells me that the quarter panel to rear panel fit and the deck lid to rear panel fit is nice and uniform. Oftentimes when these cars get hit in the rear, they body work it over here and it pulls it out here, so you end up with no gap in the middle and it's almost on top of it, and the fit, we wonder why the deck lid doesn't fit. So without getting into the specifics, that's basically how to look at the unibody fit on a nice car. So now we're going to go to the car that's had a sad life. It's amazing that these cars are less than 500 numbers off and were made within weeks of each other. Same year, same color, same engine, but certainly not the same life. twins separated at birth. I'm going to go over this car exactly like I did the other one, and I'm going to point out some things, and I'm going to try to figure out what had happened to this car, because it's been painted several times, it's been bodyworked several times, so it's going to be a little bit difficult. First of all, I'm going to look at the hood, the cowl, just like I did on the other one. I can see that the cowl has uniformity to the gap, but I can instantly tell the car's been painted. Besides the fact that it's a bad paint job, they oversprayed the fresh air intake grill, which is typical body man who doesn't care. But that's beside the point. So we have a nice clean gap here, and then I'm going to look down the side of this hood, and I see that the line starts uniformly, and the line actually goes away to where the hood is almost hitting the fender, and then it comes back out a little bit. So that tells me immediately that this fender is pushed in and almost hitting the hood. Plus the hood is up compared to the fender line. I can tell that right away, and then I look at the fender and I get my ruler, and instead of having a nice flat body line, you can see by the gap here, this fender has been flared out, and the fender lip is totally gone. And if I move to the front, the bumper cover is not fitting the front of the fender. What that means is this fender has been impacted and driven back and in, and then instead of fixing the crunch, somebody just smoothed it with body putty, sanded it, and let it go. I move to the other side here, and I can immediately see that the fender gap here is nice and uniform, and the bumper cover fits well, unlike this side. So that would tell me that the car has been hit on the left front. I had previously looked at the inner structure. That's not part of this video, and the inner structure hasn't been damaged nor repaired, so mainly it's the fender area that was hit. So I'm going to walk over to the other side, because I can obviously see by the fender flare here and the bad gap that this has been hit on this side and bodyworked very, very poorly. I walk over to this side. Again, I see that this fender gap doesn't look so bad. The hood is up a little bit, just up a little bit, which means that if the hood is not kinked, the front end has been shortened a little bit by the front end impact. But more importantly, I look at the fender gap here and notice it's narrow here, and it starts to get wide. So I put my ruler on the side of this, and I see that, unlike the other car, this fender is facing in from the back, so it's actually bent like this. So that instantly tells me that this car has been hit hard in the left front, and the whole body is shifted over to the left, and it still is shifted over to the left. Bad fender line, the bottom of the fender in at the top, the line not fitting here, it's short on this side and bent. So next I'm going to look at the door gaps. As on the other car, door gaps were fairly uniform, with a little bit wider at the top above the exterior door latch. And I'm going to look at this one. Initially, this door gap looks okay, but I notice that it changes a little bit in here because it's been body worked. So then I open the door and I can see it. This door has been made to fit by actually grinding the edge of the door down and putting body putty on it and smoothing it down. So the door edge is very, very thick here as compared to the other side. So to make allowance for this being back, they had to cut down the edge of the fender, which is total butchery. And I close the door, and I'm looking at this now, and I can see where the line gets very narrow at the top to where the door is almost catching, as you try to open it, the top vertical roll bar seal. Classically, on rust cars, when they sag, it catches, but this is not a rust car. This is a hit car. So we get a very tight door gap. It hardly fits. And then I look down here and I see that the door gap is extremely tight, but yet down at the bottom, the door actually is coming out at the bottom to where my fingers hit. What does that mean? Well, I'll tell you what that means. I move up and I see the top here. Remember the other car, the top was supposed to hang over just a little bit. This doesn't at all, and be even or almost a little bit out from the top sail chrome, and it's not. It's actually in, which tells me that the front end impact hit this car and it bent the cowl and it moved the car over this way. So the front end swings that way, the rear end swings this way, causing this top to move over like this. This side of the top is really hanging over the roll bar. The back of it is about right, but hanging over, which means the car has shifted. So we know that it's had front end damage and the front end is swung, but it doesn't make any sense because you'd think if it was swung like that, the top would be hung over there and forward there. So something else has got to be going on. So I look at this door gap and I see that this door is out at the top and it almost looks like it's even right here. So I think that doesn't make any sense, but the door is not fitting the cavity correctly. So I open the door and I look, and you can't see it, but the bottom hinge has been shimmed. So somebody has shimmed the hinge to try to make the door fit the cavity better, and it's never going to until the body shell is straightened. Fairly uniform here, hanging out here, in on the other side. That actually tells me that the whole shell has been twisted this way, and we don't know how in the world it was twisted in the past. It could have even been a rollover. We don't know. But the body shell is twisted in here, out there, in there. So the whole shell is over this way. So it needs to be tied down and brought back over. And actually, this car is here for that very reason. We're going to put it on our frame rack and straighten this. And it's going to be a tedious proposition, but the customer didn't want to repaint this car until the body was straight. So now I go to the back, and I'm looking at the back line here. And first of all, I look at the alignment on the left and the right grills, which is nice and uniform. This deck lid happens to fit perfectly because we can look at the welting and it's all in a line. So this line is good. And I look down the side. This deck lid's over a little bit, but that's not so bad. But then the line is going away to where my finger gets tight. So wide here, narrow here, and the deck lid is up in the back. These cars were made to take a blow and not hurt the passenger compartment, so they all bent down when they were hit. Commonly, we see a 914 hit front and rear. The front's down, the rear's down, the transmission drops when the ears break off, and the passenger compartment is perfect. I've seen very few over the years where somebody's actually gotten hurt. So I go to the other line here, and this line looks fairly uniform. But there's fresh paint on here that, of course, doesn't match. And the rear quarter panel fits here, and it fits here as far as the flow of the line, but the deck lid is up, and you can't put it down anymore. And that's because the whole rear end of this car is down, and it's swung over that way. So why? Well, this will tell right over here. So we remember the car we just did, and we compare it, the quarter panel, to this one. This yardstick rocks wildly because if you look from the back, like the front, there's a big flare in the rear of this quarter panel, and somebody took the crunch, they body worked it, and smoothed it down and painted it before they straightened the unibody. And I know that if I took the tire off and looked at the inner structure, there'd be a bend in the inner structure as well that hadn't been straightened. So we know this car has been hit in the rear, dumped down in the rear. The rear end is still low, and as evidenced by the deck lid, it's low on both sides, and this quarter panel is flared. This would probably hold a 7-inch wheel for you racers, but it won't on the other side, only 5.5 inch. And then the body line again, besides the twist, has been impacted. So we have multiple hits on this car, And if I had to decide, by the way, the Porsche crest is way off. That's ridiculous, but I like the cars to be correct. If I had to decide what had happened to this car, I would say that this has had multiple accidents. 1, left front. 2, the rear. 3, body twists. They could have rolled the car. They could have run off the road. It doesn't take much to run off the road, trip the car, and bend the unibody because, of course, the roof comes off and there's no connection between the rear and the front. We're going to put this car in our frame rack. It'll probably take 3 days to straighten the shell. The paint's going to crack, and then it's going to have to be stripped to bare metal and every body panel redone and then fixed and painted, and it'll finally have a car that will look at least as nice as this, but for a lot more expenditure than you probably could have purchased this car for to begin with. So that's the story. We have 2 914s that came off the assembly line, virtually one right after the other. One's lived an easy, joyous life, the other's lived a hard life. But that doesn't mean the hard life can't be restored if you spend enough time doing it. Thanks for watching. Dr. 914, George Hussey, Automobile Atlanta.